The winter of the Middle Ages was not merely a season, it was an enemy. Picture a village buried in snow, its thatched roofs sagging under the weight of ice. The smoke from the chimneys grows thinner each day, until at last there is none. Inside one of the huts, a family huddles close, wrapped in rags, their breath forming pale clouds in the frozen air. The fire has long since gone out. The food stores are empty, and so they sit in silence, staring into the dark, half hoping that if they close their eyes they may not wake again. For the peasant, there was no greater dream than to simply fall asleep and remain asleep until the thaw returned. To hibernate like a bear, to surrender to slumber and escape hunger's gnawing teeth. That was the fantasy whispered in the stillness of long nights. It was not laziness nor idleness. It was desperation. In the endless, bitter winters, survival was measured in hours, not days, and the very act of being awake meant burning precious energy that could not be replaced. In the Middle Ages, famine was not an abstract concept. It was a living curse. Crops failed with terrifying frequency. Too much rain, too little sun, a sudden frost, or a swarm of locusts could destroy the year's harvest in an instant. And when the autumn granaries emptied and no fresh bread could be baked, winter stretched ahead like a death sentence. In these times, people spoke of sleeping the hunger away, of letting time pass in dreams until the green shoots of spring returned. We, in the modern age, see hibernation as the privilege of animals, a marvel of nature. But to the medieval peasant, it was envy. They watched hedgehogs curl into dens, bears vanish into caves, and snakes coil beneath stones, all surrendering to months of silence, while man was cursed to stay awake and starve. If only, they thought, God had given them that gift. Stories and whispers tell of villages where families did little more than lie beneath firs for days on end, rising only when hunger could not be ignored. They conserved energy the only way they could, by sleeping, by refusing to move, by shrinking life down to its barest form. Children were lulled to sleep not by lullabies, but by exhaustion, their bellies empty. Adults drifted between wakefulness and stupor, measuring time not in meals, but in how many nights they could endure without food. The idea of hibernation became a strange kind of hope, a dream not of life, but of survival without suffering. Sleep was the peasant's rebellion against hunger. To close one's eyes was to cheat starvation for a few more hours, to blur the cruel reality that life had become. And when prayers to the church could not bring food, when pleas to the Lord of the Manor fell on deaf ears, sleep was the last refuge left. It is haunting to imagine entire villages that seemed to fall into silence, where little stirred but the wind through frozen fields, as though the world itself had chosen to sleep. And within that silence, the peasants prayed for a miracle, or for nothing at all. The dream of hibernation was no fantasy of comfort. It was born of despair. For medieval peasants, sleep was not rest. It was survival. Winter in the Middle Ages was not merely cold, it was merciless. For the medieval peasant, it arrived like a conqueror, laying siege to the land and starving it into submission. By November, the last scraps of harvest had been collected, the grain stored, and the livestock slaughtered for what little meat could be salted and preserved. Yet, no matter how carefully the peasants prepared, the stores always seemed to run out before the snow melted. The earth itself turned against them, locking its bounty beneath a blanket of ice. The land was the peasant's lifeline, but in winter it was nothing but a barren wasteland. Fields that once waved with wheat and barley now lay flat and lifeless, stiff with frost. The soil hardened into stone, refusing to yield anything. Streams froze over, and what water could be gathered was icy and scarce. Cows and goats, if they had survived the autumn slaughter, grew thin, their ribs jutting out beneath matted fur. Chickens stopped laying. Hunger became a presence in every home. A silent guest that sat at the table where food should have been. Hunger alone might have been bearable, but it was joined by cold, a torment that gnawed at bones and drained life from the body. The peasants' huts were fragile defenses against the winter air, walls of mud and timber, roofs patched with straw, drafty and thin. A single fire might warm the room, but wood was as precious as bread. For many families, the choice was stark: burn the last log and survive another night, or save it and face the frost. And when the fire burned out, the cold crept in like a predator. It was not unusual for entire families to sleep in one bed, pressed together for warmth, often alongside animals. The body heat of a pig or cow could mean the difference between life and death. And still, despite the desperate measures, people froze where they lay. Mothers would wake to find children stiff and silent beside them, their breath stilled by the winter air. Old men and women closed their eyes one evening and never opened them again. Winter also brought isolation. The roads became treacherous, coated in snow and ice, cutting off villages from trade and help. Those who set out in search of food often never returned, swallowed by storms or weakened by hunger along the way. Each settlement became an island in a sea of white, forced to endure with whatever supplies they had left. The lords who ruled over these peasants rarely suffered as cruelly. Within the stone walls of castles, feasts still flickered by torchlight, though even nobility knew shortages. But it was the peasant, the tiller of the soil, who bore the brunt of winter's wrath. Their lives depended on the cycle of the seasons, and winter was the cruelest reminder that nature held all the power. To endure these months was to endure suffering beyond measure, and so the thought of hibernation, of escaping the hunger and cold by sleeping them away, was more than fantasy. It was survival imagined in its most merciful form. If only, the peasants thought, they could sleep through this season of death and wake when the earth once again turned green. In the modern mind, the bed is a place of rest, comfort, even safety. But for the medieval peasant, in the depths of winter, the bed could become a coffin. Imagine a family of 6 pressed together on a straw mattress, their bodies wrapped in thin wool, the air so cold that each breath turned into frost. They did not sleep for comfort. They slept for survival. And sometimes, they did not wake at all. There are accounts of families dragging their bedding into the stables, choosing to lie beside cows and goats. The heat from the animals, the warm breath rising in the gloom, offered more security than the meager hearth inside their huts. A peasant's greatest ally in winter was not his lord, not his church, but the animal he once tended in the fields. The pig that might have been slaughtered became a sleeping companion, its body heat shielding children from death. Yet even this measure was fragile, for when the animals grew too weak to live, the warmth went with them. The bed, then, was not just a place to rest. It was a gamble. To close your eyes was to surrender to the cold. And in the morning, not all would rise again. Neighbors spoke of waking beside lifeless companions, of shaking children who no longer stirred, of husbands and wives frozen silently in the night. It was not uncommon for a single hut to lose 2, 3, even all its members before spring returned. The very structure of medieval houses deepened the misery. Windows, if they existed at all, were small holes stuffed with cloth or wood. The wind crept through cracks in the walls and under the doors. The thatch above was damp and heavy with frost, dripping onto the bed below. Beneath the mattress of straw, the ground itself was ice. There was no escape. In such conditions, sleep became paradoxical. It was both a refuge and a threat. To stay awake meant suffering through hunger and shivering until exhaustion claimed the body. To sleep was to risk slipping into death's embrace, lulled by the false comfort of warmth that never came. And still, the peasants longed for the chance to hibernate, to stretch sleep into weeks, to let the cruelty of winter pass them by unseen. For them, the dream was simple: to sleep and not wake until the thaw. To sleep and wake to bird song instead of silence, to open their eyes to green fields, to bread once more on the table, to children laughing instead of starving. But for many, that dream was never fulfilled. Their long sleep stretched into eternity, and the frozen bed became their grave. This was why the idea of hibernation haunted their minds. For animals, winter was endured in hidden dens and burrows. For humans, it was endured in beds that could not always promise survival. A cruel irony lingered. What they envied in beasts, they sometimes achieved in death. Hunger was the true tyrant of the Middle Ages, and winter was its cruelest weapon. The peasants' days stretched into gray monotony, measured not by sunlight or bells, but by the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. When food stores dwindled, desperation drove them to eat what should never be eaten. The daily meal, if it could be called that, was a thin gruel made of water, and whatever scraps could be found. Barley husks, pea pods, or bread so stale it had to be soaked in broth before it could be chewed. Bread itself, once the heart of the medieval diet, became a bitter parody in times of famine. People ground bark into flour, mixed straw with meal, even boiled moss to stretch their supplies. The loaves that emerged were dark, coarse, and barely edible. Yet they were clutched with trembling hands as though they were treasures. The children suffered first. Thin faces, hollow eyes, distended bellies from malnutrition. These became the winter's most tragic sights. Mothers tried to hush their cries with promises that spring would come soon, but spring was months away. Fathers grew silent, haunted by the shame of being unable to provide. Neighbors whispered of families reduced to fighting over crusts of bread or stealing from one another, breaking the fragile bonds of community that once held them together. Hunger stripped away dignity. A noble feast was unthinkable for peasants. Even a single egg or piece of cheese became a luxury. Those who still had livestock sometimes slaughtered animals too soon, desperate for meat, only to find themselves starving later without milk or beasts of burden. The choices were impossible. Kill the last chicken today and eat, or keep it alive and risk death by hunger tomorrow. And always, hunger made the body weaker, more vulnerable to the cold. A starving man could not chop wood, could not work the fields, could not protect his family. The cycle was vicious. Hunger bred weakness, weakness bred idleness, and idleness bred more hunger. To escape it, peasants longed for sleep, to shut their eyes and silence the pangs that tore at their insides. In dreams, they could imagine bread, meat, and wine. Awake, there was only emptiness. For many, the hardest part was not their own hunger, but watching loved ones waste away. To see a child refuse food, too weak to eat. To see the elderly offer their portion so that others might live. To see death creeping into the household day by day. It was these images that carved themselves deepest into memory. And so, as winter dragged on, the peasants prayed not for feasts or miracles, but for numbness. They prayed for the mercy of long sleep, for days to pass without the agony of hunger, for the chance to awaken when the earth once again offered life. The dream of hibernation was more than escape. It was salvation. If only they could close their eyes long enough, perhaps they might open them again in a gentler season. The medieval peasant lived in a world saturated with faith. Every hour of their day, every crop in their field, every coin they earned was believed to rest under the watchful eye of God. Yet, in the depths of winter, when hunger gnawed and cold hollowed out their bodies, faith collided with desperation. Sleep, so simple, so human, became entangled with both religion and survival. Priests told their flocks that hunger was a test of endurance, a trial sent by God to purify their souls. Famine, they preached, was the punishment for sin, and only through prayer and penance would mercy come. But peasants had little strength for long prayers when their bellies were empty. Instead, many turned inward, clinging to the belief that sleep itself was a gift from God. To drift into unconsciousness was not weakness, it was divine reprieve. It dulled the edge of hunger, numbed the cold, and brought fleeting dreams of warmth. Some chroniclers speak of entire villages entering what seemed like a rhythm of half-life. People lying in their huts, wrapped in cloaks, waking only briefly to drink water, chew a crust of bark bread, or stoke the dying embers of a fire. The rest of the time, they surrendered themselves to slumber. It was not hibernation in the animal sense, but a human imitation born of necessity. To the peasants, it felt holy, a way to endure without constant sinning against their neighbors for scraps of food. Religious symbolism crept into this dream of sleep. Death itself was often called eternal sleep, and so each winter nap carried an edge of danger, as though the soul hovered between life and heaven. Families prayed before sleeping, begging God to let them wake again. When some did not, survivors consoled themselves that the Lord had merely carried them into his arms. In this way, sleep became both feared and desired, feared as a step toward death, desired as the only escape from suffering. In monasteries, monks recorded how peasants seemed to fade away during harsh winters, their days shrinking into silence. One abbot wrote of villagers who lived like the bears, though they were not bears, and their prayers were fewer, for their tongues were heavy with hunger. To him, it was evidence of God's chastisement. To the peasants themselves, it was mercy. Slumber was the closest they could come to hibernation, the only illusion of survival they had. And yet the tension remained. The church urged fasting as a sign of devotion, even as famine already forced it upon the people. To sleep through hunger was, in a strange way, to obey both body and God. It was a compromise between faith and flesh, a fragile balance that gave them hope, however thin. When the nights grew long and the cold deepened, sleep became prayer without words. Each closed eye was a plea, "Let me wake tomorrow." Each dream was a vision of spring. Each slumber was a surrender to both faith and fate. History leaves behind curious fragments, whispers of the past etched in ink by monks and chroniclers. Among them are rare but striking accounts of villages in medieval Europe that seem to fall into silence during famine-stricken winters, as though human beings had attempted, in their own desperate way, to mimic the hibernation of animals. The Great Famine of 1315–1317 left Europe scarred, and it is in this period that we hear of peasants who did little more than lie beneath their cloaks for days at a time. Monastic records describe how some families survived by drastically reducing activity, conserving every ounce of energy. They slept long hours, waking only to drink a thin broth, chew a scrap of leather softened in water, or tend a fading ember in the hearth. One scribe observed with a mixture of pity and disdain, "They live as though dead, moving little, speaking little, their bodies stretched out in their huts as though the world itself were in slumber." Such accounts suggest that while true hibernation was impossible for humans, what the peasants achieved was something close to seasonal dormancy. Villages grew eerily quiet. The clang of tools in the fields, the chatter of markets, the sound of bells marking daily work, all fell into silence. Instead, entire communities seemed to sink into a collective half-sleep, conserving life in the only way they could. For outsiders, nobles, travelers, or church officials, the sight was haunting. A visiting priest wrote of entering a hamlet where no one greeted him, only to discover families motionless in their huts, their bodies huddled together like bundles of rags. He thought at first they were corpses, but then one stirred, opened weary eyes, and returned to sleep without a word. The chronicles also reveal the deep shame peasants felt in such conditions. Medieval society valued labor above all, and to be idle was seen as sinful. But famine left them no choice. Too weak to till the frozen soil, too frail to walk miles in search of food, they lay in their huts, praying for spring. The silence of these villages was not laziness, but survival. These records, scattered across Europe, form a mosaic of human endurance. They tell us that peasants were not simply victims of hunger. They were resourceful, adapting in the only way their bodies allowed. If they could not eat, they would sleep. If they could not work, they would endure by doing nothing at all. Their hibernation was not chosen, but enforced by a world that seemed determined to kill them. For us today, such chronicles sound almost mythical, as though lifted from a dark folk tale. But for the medieval villager, they were simple truth. Winter was not life, it was suspension. Survival meant slowing the body to its weakest rhythm, conserving breath, conserving strength, and waiting for time itself to change. And when spring finally returned, the villages would stir again, emerging from their strange, enforced slumber. Yet the memory of those silent months never left them. It haunted their dreams, a reminder of how close humanity could come to imitating the beasts in their dens, and how fragile the line between life and death truly was. At first, the dream of hibernation was a comfort. To sleep long hours, to drift into silence, was to dull the knife edge of hunger. But as weeks passed, and the snow showed no sign of retreat, that dream twisted into something darker. Sleep, once a shield, became a threshold, and peasants knew well how thin the line was between resting and never waking again. In huts across Europe, men and women whispered of neighbors who went to bed and simply did not rise. Some families spoke of loved ones who seemed peaceful in slumber, their faces calm, only to discover death had claimed them quietly in the night. These were not deaths of violence or plague, but of surrender, bodies too weak to rouse from the half-death of starvation. Sleep had turned from salvation into silent executioner. Desperation followed swiftly. When the stomach ached beyond bearing, peasants clawed for anything edible. Leather belts boiled into broth, straw chewed until gums bled, even candles made from animal fat were consumed in madness. The dream of sleeping away the famine collapsed under the brutal reality that time moved too slowly. To sleep was no longer enough. The body demanded sustenance, and there was none to give. It is in these moments that chronicles speak of the unthinkable. In sieges, where cities were cut off for months, starving men and women turned on the dead, and sometimes on the living. Rumors spread of cannibalism during the Great Famine of 1315, of parents driven to madness, of travelers waylaid not for their coin, but for their flesh. These stories are shrouded in shame, yet their persistence suggests grim truths. For the peasants, this was the breaking point. The dream of hibernation revealed itself for what it was, a fragile illusion. Unlike bears, humans could not sleep away hunger forever. The body wasted, the mind faltered. Those who slept too long risked slipping across the invisible border where sleep became death. And those who forced themselves awake faced the horror of gnawing hunger that had no cure. Faith faltered too. People questioned why God allowed such cruelty, why prayers went unanswered, why the fields lay barren despite endless devotion. Priests urged patience, but patience does not fill an empty belly. For some, desperation birthed anger, and anger birthed rebellion. Villages turned on their lords, demanding grain hoarded in castles. Others turned inward, barricading themselves against starving neighbors. Winter, once only a season, became a battlefield where survival itself was the prize. In this desperation, the peasants' longing for hibernation soured. It was no longer a dream of peace, but a plea for escape. From hunger, from shame, from the endless nights where each breath was a struggle. Sleep, once envied in animals, now resembled death too closely to be a comfort. And yet what choice did they have? To stay awake was agony. To sleep was a gamble. The winter would end eventually. The snow would melt, the soil would soften, green shoots would return. But for many, it came too late. For those left behind, the memory of desperation, of dreams turned nightmare, clung like frost in the marrow. They would remember forever that in the cruelest of winters, even the comfort of sleep could betray them. When spring finally broke the icy grip of winter, the survivors emerged like shadows. The snow melted into rivers that carried away the dead, and the fields softened, ready once more to bear seed. Yet the memory of what had passed lingered like a curse. The peasants had lived through the long silence, through hunger so deep it hollowed their bones, through sleep so heavy it felt like death. The dream of hibernation, the fantasy that they might simply sleep away the famine, remained, but now it carried the weight of despair. Children who lived through those winters grew up with haunted eyes. They remembered lying beside siblings who never woke, remembered the whispered prayers before every night's sleep. Let me wake again. For them, the bed was no longer a place of safety, but a place of uncertainty. The memory of winters when the village slept in silence passed into legend, retold by firesides as warnings of nature's cruelty. Over time, these stories became woven into folklore. Tales of sleeping villages spread, places where hunger forced people into slumber that lasted weeks, even months. Some stories softened into myth, describing peasants who slept until spring and woke renewed, like bears in their dens. Others remained dark, speaking of whole households found lifeless, victims of the cruel bargain between hunger and sleep. Whether true or embellished, the legacy of these winters etched itself into cultural memory. For the Church, these tales served as reminders of human frailty and divine judgment. Priests preached that famine was God's scourge upon the sinful, and that sleep, whether in dreams or in death, was the soul's trial. But for the peasants, the meaning was simpler. Survival had no dignity, only endurance. They envied the beasts of the forest, whose creator had given them the mercy of hibernation, while mankind was left exposed to cold and hunger. Generations later, when famine struck again, peasants still spoke of that dream. They longed not for feasts, not for gold, but for the chance to sleep uninterrupted until the thaw. It was the simplest, most human of wishes, to close their eyes and skip the months of agony. And yet, that mercy never came. What remained was the lesson. Winter would always return, hunger would always stalk the poor, and survival demanded sacrifice. The legacy of the dream of hibernation was not hope, but resignation. To live as a peasant was to endure, and endurance meant accepting suffering as natural as the snow itself. And so the story of the sleeping peasant survived, not as triumph, but as testimony. A reminder of how close humanity came to surrendering entirely to despair. A reminder that in the harshest of times, even the dream of sleep could be both salvation and curse. When spring brought new harvests, bellies filled again, and laughter returned to the villages. But beneath the joy was a shadow, the knowledge that winter would return, and with it, the dream of a hopeless hibernation. It was a dream passed on, whispered in stories, carried in the marrow of those who survived. The dream of sleeping through suffering, the dream of waking to a kinder world.